Hello again. So, the last 2 days, we've looked at the beginning of Mark chapter 2. We've seen how Jesus healed a paralytic, but before he did it, he said, "Your sins are forgiven." The leaders didn't like that. Then, Jesus called Levi, a tax collector, to follow him. Levi said, "I want to change my life. I want to become like you." Jesus went and ate at his house. The leaders didn't like that. And so today, Mark chapter 2, verse 18. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? They can't, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. On that day, they'll fast." Fasting. You know, in the Old Testament, we read about fasting, but in the Old Testament, fasting is primarily a means of mourning. During the time in between the two testaments, the 300 to 400 years between the writing of Malachi and the writing of Matthew, we have a number of other books that are written. The books in and of themselves aren't that important, but they show us a change in Jewish thinking. One of those books, called the Psalms of Solomon, chapter 3, verse 8, says this: "The righteous continually searches his house to remove utterly all iniquity done by himself in error. He makes atonement for sins of ignorance by fasting and by afflicting his soul. And the Lord counts guiltless every pious man in his house." Now, the disciples of John and the Pharisees didn't necessarily know the Psalms of Solomon, but what they did know was that in their time, it was a commonly held belief that fasting purified you. You fasted to seek atonement for sin. You fasted to become holier. So when John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting and Jesus's disciples weren't, people wondered, well, what's this about? They went to Jesus to ask, and Jesus answered by going back to the Old Testament, the practice of fasting to mourn. And he likened himself to a bridegroom who's preparing for his wedding to his bride. We are the bride, the church. Jesus said, as long as the bridegroom is with the groomsmen, why should they fast? It's not a time for mourning, it's a time for rejoicing. When the bridegroom is taken away, then they can fast. Yet again, we see Jesus doing something totally new. But when he does it, he looks back at the Old Testament, says, this is what fasting is. When you fast, you're mourning. Tomorrow, we'll continue the pattern of people rejecting what Jesus did, this time in a wheat field. See you tomorrow.